Hi, good day. I'm Assistant Professor Christiana Esguerra from the Philippines. I am a professor of journalism at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, and it's my pleasure to speak with you today about a very important topic that concerns media, journalism, and democracy. So I'd like to share my screen for this lecture. Okay, so my presentation for today is about the importance of journalism education in the context of the current challenges of journalists today, not just in my country, the Philippines, but in many other democracies across the globe. So the focus of this discussion is rethinking storytelling in journalism at this particular time in our history. Now, this discussion is focused, of course, on rethinking the strategies in terms of teaching students of journalism about not just the techniques, but also about the other principles, other important principles involved in effective teaching of journalism. Now, by definition, I purposely use this online definition of journalism to be able to put this in the proper context, especially given the challenges that we are facing now. For instance, a basic definition online of journalism is that it pertains to the activity or profession of writing for newspapers, magazines, or news websites, or preparing news for broadcasts. So if you look at the traditional definition of journalism elsewhere in the world, it pertains to the old platforms, the so-called trimedia, the print, broadcast. And broadcast, of course, was divided into television and radio. But we all know it's 2022. Things have changed and changed drastically. So, in terms of properly teaching journalism to our students, we need to recognize what is out there, the challenges outside of the classrooms, and the fact that the actual teaching of journalism is heavily not just happening inside the classroom, just like in any other areas in education. Much of the learning has to do with what's happening outside the classrooms. Now, of course, when you talk about journalism, you talk about storytelling, but factual storytelling. It involves rigorous process of data gathering, analyzing, prioritization, angling, context, and presentation. This is a definition that I developed through my experience as a professional journalist as well over the past 22 years. So it's a rigorous process in the sense that you don't just come up with a report just because you felt doing it, or just because you heard some information that was fed to you or given to you without critically evaluating that information. It involves a process, and that process is considered very rigorous. For instance, data gathering itself is rigorous in itself. And after getting all the data, you need to analyze it, prioritize which particular data or information you need to serve to the public given the context of an event. And that means you need to angle or put information based on the order of importance. And then you have to explain why this information is important to the readers. And of course, presentation, which involves how you are going to present it. So these are the areas of factual storytelling that I would like to focus on in this presentation, in the sense that all these techniques are also being challenged now by other content creators online who do not necessarily have any experience when it comes to journalism, but they're also as effective, if not even more effective, as far as influencing people's perspectives online. And these perspectives that are developed online also have very important impact, or also has a very important impact outside of the online world. So for instance, this is how propaganda is effectively spread. Much of that propaganda, for example, in the context of an election campaign, happens online, and what they see online influences their actions outside of it. Now, in this case, it's also very important to consider where the audiences are today. In the past, when we were talking about the legacy media, the so-called tri-media of TV, radio, and print, the audiences, the viewers, the readers, the listeners were very much situated and were very much captive um, by the information, by the techniques, by the processes that we were used to. For instance, there was a time when journalists were basically the agenda setters and the most important agenda setters. There's this concept of what we call shared community in journalism, in the sense that, for example, a newspaper, everything that is published in a newspaper, let's say on a particular day, in particular, the headline becomes the most important topic that can be discussed for the next few days, if not even weeks. There was also a time when families gathered around the television over dinner and watched the primetime newscast. And of course, because of the advent of the internet, because of the many available platforms online, the so-called shared community has drastically changed. It created different bubbles or silos within populations, so much so that our different worldviews are affected by the kind of bubbles or echo chambers that we are in. And much of these echo chambers or bubbles are influenced, if not dictated, by the algorithms, for instance, of YouTube, Google, Facebook, TikTok. So there's heavy influence coming from the platform itself. And we have to recognize that as journalists, we have to go to these platforms as well. And many of us are doing that already. But my question is, how effective are we doing this, especially compared to other content creators who are already in those platforms? Content creators who do not necessarily have any journalism degree or even a bachelor's degree that could or approximate something that is related to communication or journalism. Meaning, in short, anybody could come up with a content online and be very effective. Uh, it could influence a lot of people. In that case, people who are who are heavily influenced by this content online coming from this different content creators might not necessarily find journalists themselves as reliable. So this is the context in which I'd like to reevaluate the kind of curriculum or programs that we have in different schools, in particular in the Philippines. And this might also be useful in the context of journalism education in Poland. So where's the audience today? For instance, according to the Pew Research Center, this is in the context of the United States, um, a large majority of Americans get their news on digital services or devices. So 60% of them get their news from, or often get their news from smartphones, computers, and tablets. 40% of them get their information or news from television. 16% often got their information from radio, and only 10% often got their information from print. Now, it's also important to consider the net data involved here. So smartphones, computers, and tablets, we're talking here of 86%. So this means that this incorporates both the segment of the population that said, or the respondents that said they often or sometimes got their information or news from smartphones, computers, and tablets. So this is a big majority, 86%. Now, according to the same research, roughly half of Americans prefer to get news on a digital platform, and about a third prefer television. So digital platforms, basically online, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and websites are the preferred platforms by 52%, or half, or one out of two Americans, while only a third of them prefer to get their news from the television. Now, in the Philippine context, it's the same. For instance, where Filipinos get their news. Remember, we are a population of 110 million people. And just last May, we elected our new president. He is the son of the former dictator in the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. So the son and namesake won the presidency last May. Um, I will discuss this in a separate lecture, but it's important to recognize the fact that the digital platforms exert heavy influence on on the population, on Filipinos. And according to the recent Digital News Report 2022 by the Reuters Institute, the sources of news of Filipinos are as follows. 60% of the respondents who participated in that online survey said that they still got their news from television, uh, which compared to, let's say, the number of the respondents who said that they got their information online, including social media, 88%. So it's much bigger, okay, compared to those who said that they got their news from the television. And only 16% of the respondents said that they got their news from print, while 73% said they got their information from social media. So in terms of devices, 37% uh, got their news by using computers. 11% said they got their news online using tablets. And 80%, or 8 out of 10 Filipino respondents said that they made use of smartphones to access news from different digital resources. Now, it's very important to consider the context that we are in now to be able to better evaluate the kind of journalism program that we are offering to our students. The basic question is the curriculum working? Are we producing better journalists using the program that we have at present? It's very important to point out that there still should be a prioritization when it comes to the kind of program that we are introducing to our students. In the Philippines, for instance, there's the so-called print priority because many of the journalism programs are still hinged on the traditional setting when it comes to teaching journalism. But this prioritization or orientation has been changing over the years. But if you ask me, it's still important to consider training students how to write under the so-called context of the print priority before they consider or before they are trained in terms of other storytelling techniques outside of the print medium. Today we're seeing the transition, the very strong transition, and a very challenging one from the traditional news techniques and settings that we have been used to the so-called digital space. Now, we know that a lot of people consume their news on TikTok. In the latest Digital News Report 2022 in the Philippines, for instance, 15% of the respondents said they got their news from TikTok, which was a drastic increase from the previous year's survey or digital news report, which said that only 2% of the respondents got their news from TikTok. So from 2% to 15%, that's a big one. Now, are we training journalists to be able to better tell stories, let's say on TikTok? Or are they left to their own devices, let them learn the platform themselves? Or are we teaching them or guiding them how to properly make use of this platform for better storytelling? That is one question. Now, that question gives birth to another question. What kind of teachers are available in schools to be able to teach young students better access, let's say, or better make use of platforms such as TikTok? There's a so-called model curricula for journalism education coming from UNESCO. And for instance, there's a difference between a bachelor's degree with 3 years and 4 years. And honestly, this is very comprehensive. And this is a very effective guide for journalism schools to come up with a uniform curriculum or curricula to produce good journalists. But of course, as I mentioned, there's a need to reevaluate all these techniques. Gone should be the days where there was a very heavy debate when it comes to the amount of theoretical subjects that should be incorporated in a journalism curriculum and the kind of practical lessons or subjects that could be or should be incorporated. There should be a balance which heavily considers the kind of environment that will be available or that is already available to our students even before they graduate. For example, when it comes to teaching news writing, journalism schools are not supposed to teach only students or to, are not supposed to only teach students how to write news for newspapers, for news magazines, for television broadcasts, but also how do you write news, for instance, for TikTok? How do you do captions for YouTube? How do you do captions on Facebook? How do you better write, for example, quote cards? These are techniques that involve a lot of context given the limited space that is available to you. How do we make use, for instance, of Twitter or live tweeting or threads on Twitter to be able to tell a story? That is very challenging to many journalists because many journalists forget the idea that you should be able to tell your story while minimizing uh, your personal presence in that particular storytelling, which is, of course, a traditional perspective when it comes to journalism. But these days, that perspective is challenged because engagement on social media is important. And in many cases, audiences who are on social media find it more effective or more credible if their journalists are also involved in the storytelling, which is why, for instance, many content creators are very good at what they do because they are involved. There's authenticity, there's rawness in their presentation of information. And traditionally, journalists are not supposed to be like that. And to be honest, this particular traditional perspective becomes some sort of a handicap. Now, as educators, what should we teach our students? Should we tell them you have to stick to the traditional sense that journalists should only work behind the scenes, should never be part of the story, which I agree very much. I agree to very much. But again, given the challenges in social media, we have to reevaluate that particular perspective to be able to better compete with other content creators, to be able to better make sense of information available online. So part of the techniques that we need to evaluate is that should we focus more on visual storytelling without forgetting our print tradition? We should focus on more contexts. We should strengthen the ethical dimension of our journalism education. And of course, number four, we should strengthen critical thinking or training students how to become critical thinkers in our journalism programs. I mentioned more visual just not because it's a common expectation, but based, for example, in the recent findings by Internews, a non-governmental organization that operates in many different countries, including the Philippines, in their study of disinformation strategies, they found that videos are most effective in terms of spreading disinformation. Disinformation uh, was thriving much better on social media, online, because of the visual orientation of certain presentations, meaning videos are more effective in capturing the imagination or the interests of the audience online. Now, as journalism educators, perhaps there is also a need to consider this particular development. We need to teach students, our students, to become better visual storytellers in specific platforms available to us. There's a difference between visual storytelling on TikTok, visual storytelling on Instagram, visual storytelling on YouTube. So these are the things that should be properly parsed in terms of teaching education or teaching journalism. And of course, context is very, very important. One challenge, for instance, experienced by many journalists who decided to jump into storytelling online, in particular, let's say YouTube or TikTok or Instagram, was that some of the traditional rules in journalism that we know, meaning the importance of attribution, the importance of using independent sources. Okay, um, sometimes many content creators get away by sharing information without citing their sources. This is one technique that should not be forgotten. Okay. And number three, strengthen the ethical dimensions, because this is something that we cannot avoid or sweep under the rug, especially given all these unethical practices that we're seeing online. And of course, critical thinking is very, very important, especially given that many of our audiences have become uncritical thinkers now. That's why they become even more susceptible to fake news or disinformation. Okay. So that ends this brief lecture, and I hope this could trigger further conversations about the subject matter. Thank you very much, and have a good day.